No did it. Oh, yeah.
Good morning, and welcome everyone for joining us for this wonderful teaching of Geshe, continuing with Kamalashila's text. Everything that you'll need to know should show up in the chat box. So we'll begin right away with our morning recitations.
The teacher, endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, knower of the world, supreme guide of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha, endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies, form supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, supreme God, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn out Meru, 4 lands, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offer to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Oh, yeah. This mantra.
Yes.
That's all. Oh, yeah. Taring Bachisa. Oh, yeah, that is. Shido Pakbar Kawa Kavayum, Shishin Komba Drizzy Zablinkin, Ludu Tommy in the Station Yonsu Trape Shabla Kusas. Oh, yeah. That's what I. Simje Tamje Tandra, Tari Tenjo, Dava Giadan Jorbachu Son and Billy Rumbuch Tobe Cabdelia, and this Sunday Tambalia, Tosan Kosum Sigi, Bekoga Sabuto Becamdelia. Oh, Dination and Gotsune, Kiwane Kiwa, Satami, Kova Tobachene. Oh, Dennis Simje Tamjegi, Tarsimba Tutungengi, Sanjay Kova. Rambuchi Chine Jan Tobracha awesome. The Shedo, and Tandane, Tabdan Shilakson and Sambutan, she's a Neju Shiba, she's a Neju Shiba, Shirab Chalia, and the Kombachi in Samsa, Gulon, Kombachi and the Tar, Tabdan Shirabia, Sambutan, Shin, you got Tarchimbe, and this seems like it turned to Tunga. This one. Sanjay Kobanchi and Tobracha Yamdo. Oh, Samba Sambucha, you to Semkin, and it's Samba shoes. Yeah.
No. So to begin with, we should think that for the sake of all sentient beings, I want to attain this state of Buddhahood. And right now I have the ability in that I have all of the sort of freedoms and leisures, the opportunities to be able to practice. And if I take advantage of this situation, then I will be able to, in my future lives, continue to take good rebirths as a human or a god and progress toward that state of Buddhahood. So with that in mind, we should think I'm going to, by any means necessary, attain this precious state of enlightenment, this precious state of Buddhahood. And in order to do that, we need both the sort of good works of the method side and the wisdom that arises from knowing the reality of knowable objects. So we should strive in our wisdom in order to understand the nature of reality, as well as our good acts, uniting wisdom and method. We should think that I will, by any means, attain this state of Buddhahood, and in this way give rise to a bodhicitta motivation for listening to these teachings.
Oh, yeah. Tang as a Christian side did Roswa. Shine come Sarset, Shine Julie. And it all had on Tarbatobecheto, Tongbani talk about how don't come go grace. And it Tongbani talk about how don't come Kuduza, and it take Conanis in that Mobu Nelu Tarto, but let the Conanis Rada. Tagaras and Nelu Tatu Paterale, Dele Havachin Nelu Meotis, Sigara, Teconani. Maybe Nelu Teconani the talk of the Esse. Oh, maybe Nelu Teconani the Kangito of the Senna. They Sita Chimbatan, Sutim Dancer, but some day she was over powder to Chimba, Drug Yamli or oh, Tinane, she rubbed the dog of the Esse. Tambo Sebase in the dog yato. The Conani said, Coco Gusba, Musum to talk to your mother. Can the shirab the Chebache and talk with Otto. Or tea in the Zaco shirab the Paru to Chibenyamli, the shirab the taxi and talk with us. Timato Paru to Chimbashan, some day stitched to Yambasha with some denda, Rava Sabata, Shandagane, Pajin Shandage, Tambuto to talk to my research. Oh, Tendici Roswa, yeah, teach you Lamna. Mount of the
So here, as far as where we had left off last time, we had talked about the necessity of giving rise to serenity, how one generates serenity within one's own continuum. And once one has done that, then we need to go on to meditate on insight, to develop this kind of insight regarding the ultimate nature of phenomena, their final sort of reality, sometimes called suchness, the suchness of phenomena. And so when we look at, well, by what do we know? How do we come come to know the sort of nature of things, their ultimate reality. And among the 6 perfections of generosity and ethics, patience, joyous effort, serenity, and insight or wisdom, it is through wisdom that we are able to, and it's not immediately recognize or realize the nature of reality, but rather it is through that wisdom that we investigate and come eventually to know that reality directly. And so the first 5 of these perfections can't realize this kind of nature of reality. Although we generate the earlier perfections, it's on the basis of wisdom that we are able to cultivate that understanding.
Oh yeah, they do kasura. Tambu to do sata, sirabji chevachen to ora. To chasune number ya thing is something to do with over it. Toma das in bare some mabachene, samba chichushan to madison gardo. That you sirabji chevachen to chasuna, and there's something the thing is to do with to oh, that toja de caresana. And it Takonani told the Kansa time with the Chili time is in Yora. Dinema Kansa time with the Chili time in Shigdua. Dinner the Tambu Kansa time with the Shigdua. And it Kansa Dami Sheduza, Kaja Shevson, Dinema Gedrosa. Kansa de Pumbule, and it's more chicks and editor, chicks and editor. Pumbutang or chicks and your mares. Kansa de Pumbutang or Tadech and your mares, Tishigdua. Well, this year the Garrison Kansa, don't number to be Kansa to Sigara. She does so then attack the Kansa the Sigara. Then attack the Kansa the Gazahaku Yara. So Hakura, Tati Singidua, the Tanya Betadra, this Egio Maratanda. Oh, Tenet Talia Capture, Gunzilla Bangazo. Kanshimo Bonam de Shala Rama Lebango Ranshin, Teme Bonet Amebo Sonashi, and a Rawando Trubam, Tantamba Trubam, Temper Truba Share, Ranguna Truba, Rangango Truba Share. Oh, Tita de Cago Yorto. Tita Giona, that's a need your creation, Gora. Tadi, Pumbula Tenepa, Tagbatesa Maimba, Koranguna Chiviana, and the Pumbutu Pa. Yara Chija Pass, Timari, Tandirishas, Kadula, Gunzin, Kuyardon. O Tiana Taka, the rest, Pumbunga, and Rebe, Pumbutarabe, Pumbutata, Chichen, and all Chichen Yore, no Tadish Yorbe, Carres, Titchabachidua. Chita Tadi Sigomata, what I'm still good. Yeah, digital not to this.
So here, then, when we first sort of come to an understanding of this nature of reality, we aren't really able to immediately engage in this in a sort of meditative equipoise, but rather it's by investigation and analysis that we come to a kind of decisive understanding. And that then allows us to take that into our meditation, into the meditative kind of stabilization and observe it within that context. But we can't do this when we just have sort of a rough understanding of emptiness. We first have to engage in this kind of analysis that then allows us to approach it within meditative stabilization. So when we think, well, what is it that is to be realized? Well, we are striving to realize the selflessness of the person and phenomena. So as we had gone through last time, the person is not this essentially the same as, nor is it essentially different from the aggregates. So here we are talking about some kind of ultimately really truly established self, the way that it appears to us. We're not talking about just sort of like our conventional self. When we are speaking of that conventional self, that's not something that we can negate. We all know that that kind of exists. But what we are refuting is some kind of self that has some sort of autonomous existence, some kind of true or inherent existence from its own side that is not contingent or dependent dependent upon anything else. This is the sort of self that we are refuting. And this is something that if it were searched for, we would have to be able to find it, not just as sort of a mere designation on the basis of the aggregates, but we would need to be able to point to either one of the aggregates or something, if it's essentially different, if this self is essentially different from the aggregates, then something outside of that we would have to be able to point to. But as we can't do that, it's neither essentially the same as the aggregates nor essentially different from, we come to the conclusion that such an I or a self cannot exist, a person.
Oh yeah. That's Geshe Yeshe Yana Sosu Sobura Sosu Sobula Tena Tanga Tete Geshe Yeshe Thabkhe Nerwa Sobula Tene and a tas palu Tayora Tabataga Tayota to Sobare Tanya Beshebe Wagi Roa Dinderes Takshila Tene Teres Patagdoa Tabataga Tayuchi Sobare Tancharanti Tades Gada Kare Basana, the Chechutan Raya Shanda Kayomare. Susulupa, Taxi Koranta, Maigesi, Sobota, Semda Soat and Dushita, Chawachita, Chikarina Chilitene, and it Nadu, Nate, Neshegi, Nanyangi, some such a doa. Or Lus Sambataga, Sobata, Tanyangi, I'm joining to the Tagachun Yangi. Kaneshi Shete Soboku Yesi Tagachi Sheriora, Tagare Sobre, Simbache with a tear. Togwepa Tag some Suda, Togwepa Tag, but taste some day. Koyodan is over it, she don't tanya to Yodan is over it. Tati Mare takes over Mara, Tanda, dancing at the round to Yoda. Lupa Tag about some Maimba, Koran to Yoda Samna, and it turned number of your set it in Ra. Ranguna Yabase. Tagindi Shanda Pumbuchilatan and Sutan of Yoswa, Shanda Gilatus and Jelny over the Chaswa. Namada Kokorang when they are Sessona. Namjunga do something not in the Restua. Nangaranga year some satisfaction, so what it is, and this hard as some matter. Tandachi and I Shagdo, Ranguna Segado, Ranging Yaba, Ranguna Yaba, Rawado Yaba. Taxi to Yoba. Taxi checks a Karim Basan and Diris and Zugutu such a some Gadoa. The Shipongula Tene and the part about some Rochi Marwa. There's some Nano Shuksha between the Gumarwa, the Shivaji Shuksha Gumara. So well at Tenepa, some get talk by and make it talk about some years, some Rochi Madoa. Talk about some Machimba. Oh, it is a Maranga, Ranga to you or some. Tanda Sena, Taxuba, Chesuba, Tsukdu Truba, see you not share. Oh, you not talk about your stereora. Cavallo, that Pumbuda chicks, more chicks and the order, Pumbunga, Chalat Masungayora, Tinade, Consultadi, Consungabu, and the chicks and the order, Dangabu the Dareda, Ayana, Tadi, Nabu Maige, to what is and do Slogas, to what she orders, Titsayora. Oh, Tidico, Doctor says, Dotilla. Le Pachi, Tassare, Tawati, Mandiba, take some Jim Hudson, Tachi Yena, Tati, and that Cavallo Segura. Titsan and Rayomara, Rayana, Pumbunga and Nechi and Goriana, Pumbunga, the loss of Yogora. Chita Tada can't do use or Titsegura. Young Yachilamna.
So on the basis of, say, a form of a person, someone's form, we think, oh, that's Tashi. Or like on the basis of our own form, we observe our own sort of form and we think, oh, this is me, this is the I. And so this sort of existence that we think that the self or the person has is really something that is merely designated by mind. We designate that on the basis of one or all of the aggregates. But when we really sort of of the I as it appears to us, the self as it appears to us, seems to have some sort of existence from its own side, autonomously, that isn't really just merely designated on the basis of those aggregates. Now we have this self, a conventionally existent self. We can say like, oh, I'm listening to the Dharma based upon the sort of actions that we're engaged in. But when we really begin to search deeper and look within those 5 aggregates of form and feelings, consciousness, discernment, and karmic formations, we find that we can't point to something that exists in this sort of autonomous ultimate way, but we need to recognize that being merely designated on that basis suffices for the existence of that self. If we're to search for some sort of ultimate existence from its own side in the way that it appears to us, that's not something that we can find. So we normally have this sense of I, of the self, and it's somehow as if it were existent from its own side, as if it had this sort of autonomous existence. It's set up from its own side. It's not dependent upon our mental designation. But if there were such a self, we would have to be able to find it. It would have to be something that could bear analysis. And so if we engage in that type of like ultimate analysis, looking for such a self, we would have to find it either within those 5 aggregates, a sort of collection of those, or one of the individual 5 aggregates. It would have to be essentially the same as those, or it would have to be something essentially different, separate from the aggregates. And so here, if it were the same as the aggregates, we would fall into certain sort of problems with that, because there's multiple aggregates, and there would be different sorts of faults if we were to try to assert that it's something aside, totally apart, or essentially different from the aggregates. But it is based upon that sort of thinking that a merely designated self, something that is merely designated by thought or by mind, is not sufficient, and there needs to be some sort of more solid, real existence that we try to search for such a self. And this is something that we can't find. When we try to find that basis of designation, the thing that is designated either within the aggregates or outside, it's unfindable.
Oh yeah, oh dear, but that oh, that culture. That get the pungu die in a kitten. Pungu de Dare Suna, some Deshitagadua. The pungu de die in Senaroa. That Yuba, Rao Tati Yardo. Rao Tati said to them, Chalad Maso, Yanga Mato Yomara, Sobuchi or Semchi or then Namjibe, Soa, Sembuchi or Dushi Sesati, Yabudu, Yabumedu, Nado, Samlu Mabudua. At the Mayagenge, Ledan Yamoto, Namdo Mabuyodo. Pinanga, Namato Yomarwa. Oh, Tineta, Tingabu de die in a Sugurdo. And the careers and Abu die in a Tamabu Chaso, Tabuchi. Soso de Chi in a Soso Chitan Stars, Yomara Soso. Roteshi, the Yangatabuchina, Soso Pumbunga to die in a and a Ganga Yore. Sobongachi Yore, Semgachi Yore, Sording Are Yore, Dushiting Are Yore. At the Mayagenge, Lake Wada Migiwa. Sanging Sembatan, Yamo Simjuma with Tazukanga Tare de Ore. And the Tangadanga Reswa, Nancy Bachinanga Lava Yungudo. Tamambutadu do Archer, Pumbu Diana. Pumbunga de Dias and the Tama was child do Asgora. Dinga Jahaku to Monero.
So it appears obviously that the connection is frozen for the moment. We'll just sit tight and reflect on what we've just heard and wait till it comes back.
So Geshe is starting back in on this Lamrim section on the person lacking intrinsic nature, sort of reviewing those points that we had gone through the self, the sort of issues that would come up if the self were one with the aggregates, or if it were essentially different from the aggregates.
다 돼서야.
Dixon.
그거도 다.
난다 거기도.
돼서. 이게 다 기지전도 타와서 인구도. 기지전도 타와서도 풍부 지달 매부서. 여러분. 너들이 세상을 빠르면 다 풍부가보다 다이나 풍부그 가데经济 재배나 대단히 다经济 적으라. 대는 아주 소보데 사도 끼기도 천들이야 소보 사도 끼기라. 밤에 구달 때는 소보 사도 끼기도. 에는 거신도선 소보다가 대대도. 저지만 동게 매비차기도. 소보를 때문에 좋아하던 두시던 두지가가 다가 대대도 상황도 두배치니까 안도도. 에치만 동게 메도. 그나시는 교황아마 소소 교황아마시 교황아마 되게 소보데 다레 되어도 소보타이네 교황아마 되게 레라지 사네 에네 te 제분 요 말와 정말 교황아마 류디 치마 요 말아 진짜 그레 제바 취스 바시도 교황아마 풍부하게 다레 되어라 소보데 다레 되는데 교황아마 소보데 레사 코탄데 첸델 용 말아 소보데 균이 대 용 말아 강사디 균이 대 용으로 말아 소보데 다이네 교황아마 다데 Any less on could drive you and have shelter. Let Jeba Shuseba said the Leora. They let Majeba the Treva say, ya. Done the Sendilia, so would they die in it, so would I delicate swords die in it. Could the Savalera? I could do you at the young Amako Yomara, Pindi Yomara. Le Majeba the Treva said, I could less I am the driven your Tagadua. Or says, Tene Jawa Jamba Meteba said, Gudwa. Sanje to Zongati, Sitana, Kevachi Gurdo, Chichi Gurdo, Lungsungudwa. And it's so what the Diana saw that the Tandeta and taking him so what the Gurio Marwa. Near leading him at hesitate to the Tilus Jurose Yomarto. Tadi in a yard that change in this. Jawa Jamba Meteba, so it's a return with that. I do that. Rob says, Kissing Chilla, Bangazu, and then she left a Kazare. Yana young to quarter chapter. Yeah, don't do that.
No. So here again, if we try to find this self that really truly exists with some sort of autonomous, independent kind of existence, if we say, well, it has to be within, it is these aggregates, it is essentially one with these aggregates, well, then we fall into the problem. We have 5 aggregates. We have our form, our feelings, our consciousness, our discernment, and our karmic formations. So are all of those various things ourselves? Would we then be sort of have multiple selves for each of those aggregates, or multiple selves for each of the sort of minds and afflictions and things that come up? So if the aggregates were the self, the first sort of issue is that just as we have many aggregates, we would have many selves. And then we fall into the problem that if it were the case that the self were the aggregates, then we would also have this issue related to karma, of either wasting karma, not meeting with karma that one hasn't actually created, and not being able to remember previous lives. Because if we say that, like say our form is the self, our aggregates, including our form aggregate, is the self, then as that is newly established in this particular life, we would really have no connection with the self of this life and our previous lives, because the continuity of that form doesn't go beyond the sort of parameters of this one life. So although we may have accumulated karma in a previous life, there would be no way to meet with that, because we don't have the same self, because we have a new form in this life. We would have a new self, because the self is the aggregate, and the continuity of form doesn't span lifetimes. And so if that were the case, then you would also have the fault that those sorts of actions that one had performed with a previous form in a previous life would not be able to ripen as results in this current sort of form. And we also wouldn't be able to talk about previous lives, remembering previous life. Like when the Buddha talked about it, this at such and such a time, I was born in the past as a king or as another type of being, there wouldn't be any sort of continuity, because your form, your self would be newly established in the new life. And so how could there be that kind of connection between lives?
Oh, yeah. That division to that. That on the Rawe Tadi Pumbunga, the Chiins and the Yongudwa. Then do such a raw. That Rawe Tadi, you ever want to turn Rawe Tadi Pumbule Shan in a Sigora. Get the Pumbu Namle Shan, Pumbu Changi Mebar Jusigua. Gobulu Dugi. Get the Pumbu Namle Shan, Pumbu Changi Mebar Jus. And it Pumbunga de Nache raw. The Tadi Logayora. Chala Masungache, Antiga Tubachado, and the true Chadora. Dinga de Nache, Kakangache. And it died to what the Chadora. Get the Pumbu Namle, Sobo Pasha, Sem Pasha, Swa Pasha, the System of the Pasha, Dakora Logachi, lost to you, Nasigora. Mumbo Sebanashe. Chala Kaga, 2 Yabanashe, Chala Nache, Chalachi, Tadi sit in the Yabanasigoda. Get the Pumbu Namle Shan. Pumbu Changi Mever Jurse. Conjo Kaga and Rawe Tadi, Kologa Yoda. And a Soboge, Chawachesona. Soboke on the Takiwa Lamba, Soboke do Tagia Sera. Sobo Nadusa Nagidu Sera. Or Tindet to Mev Chagada. Soboda Bedani Pe Kagara, Laba in Nesira, Laba Eva Lerchid, and remember Lerchid Sigmara. Tata Pala Nashiri Sore, Mobo Sebo Nashiri, Pekagaris, Zuga Nashiri, and Dikujo and Dikujo Jagmarwa, or Tinashi. And a Pumbi Chawa Cheba to the Taga Chawa Cheba to your mother. And a Tan Drosso, Tan Nagidu, Ta Tesha, the young mother. And it's hard the contemplating Jamina. So there was Suraj, Ton, so there was no Tungan, Chura, Tag, the one young do, Tag, Devo do, Tag, Gibu do say Mary, Tag Tungan young to say your Marwa. So I could saw on your Maluji, so the one young girl, Tungan young girl mother, Tag the Logarva, the one young girl Marco. The town is in Dushira Chinako, or the Pavar and the Amar and the Achar and the Kambare, the Sire and the Tongeres and Dushira. It doesn't do shit with Tade, Kagan do machine get charter, and do shit that Tanya Bekagares or Tag Kagan do machine get charter. Oh, Tina Shitako number Shebage, you Sawata, Meshawada, oh, you Shebada, Meshebachuna, Tag, Chawcheba Dumare. Tina she lake Rechola Samuta, Mikivel Samuta. Loma de Samlutan, then a lesser, Sembe lesser, I call it charity of good sick to such love go some Sembe lesser, Sako Semba, Kive Chola Samlutan, Miki Chola Samlutan, Loma de Kemi Kayama get to Samlutan, lesser, it is a dog lesser, Marco, Kavas, Kivis lesser, Miki lesser, mother, Kusoch and I could lesser, mother. This a Karsora. And a thought the Condresses, Tor, Conjacing of the Simjumaboyora, a thought Tato Chesona, course, something a Tato Cherma, to talk Tato Chio Marchadura. Consupe Kagaina cigarta, Ongo 7 is back Kagaina, Tinde do the cigarette. Or the Pumbu Namles and Pumbu Seni Meber Juruse. Tinde change your good hour, teach Labna Robsia.
So then we have the idea that such an autonomous kind of a self, this sort of own powered or established from its own side self, is maybe different from the aggregates, essentially different from them. And so here, as it says, as the Nagarjuna has said in his fundamental treatise, if the self were other than the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. So if it were the case that the self were something separate from our aggregates, we have our 5 aggregates, well, then we'd have this 6th thing, the self. And so they would be able to be sort of separated out. You can set aside all of the aggregates, like set aside the form and feelings and consciousness and recognition and our karmic formations, and you'd be able to point to something else that is that self, sort of like yellow and blue, like the right hand and the left hand. And so if that were the case, that this self is essentially different from the aggregates, it couldn't share any of the characteristics of those aggregates. So for example, when our form aggregate is born, or our form aggregate ages, our form aggregate gets sick, we couldn't say, oh, I'm sick or I'm aging, I was born, because that self is different from the aggregates, sort of like a horse and a cow, or like 2 things that are unrelated, like our left hand and our right hand. If our right hand is doing something, the left hand doesn't necessarily need to do that. And so if it were the case that the aggregates and the self were totally separate like that, then we would have all of these sorts of faults, that the self could not have the characteristics, the sort of nature of the aggregates. So too, we would have, like, for our feelings, when we feel sort of something positive, or when we're suffering, or those sorts of things, well, that would just be the feeling aggregate isolated by itself. You couldn't say I'm suffering or I feel happy, because that I, that self, is totally different from the feelings. And also with regards to our discernment or our recognition, where we think like, oh, that's my mom, that's my dad, this is that, we wouldn't have the ability to say that the self is actually discerning those things, because, or recognizing those things, because that faculty or that aggregate of recognition is totally separate from the self. And so too, with our mental consciousness, we wouldn't be able to sort of say, oh, I know that clearly, or I don't know that clearly. That would just be the mental consciousness. Either your self is sort of separate from from that. And so too with our karma, with the kind of intended karma where we're thinking something virtuous or we're thinking something non-virtuous or sort of neutral, those would be the purview of the aggregates, not the self. They wouldn't have any sort of relationship to the self, and thus the self couldn't accumulate karma because none of the sort of characteristics or the actions done by the aggregates would be done by the self. And so too, when it comes to all of our mental factors, if we are angry or jealous or any of these other kinds of things, we couldn't say that the self is angry or jealous or any of that, because that would just be the sort of mental consciousness. So here, this is the kind of issue, as Nagarjuna says, if the self were other than the aggregates, essentially other than the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates.
Oh yeah. Tende de Sravasti kapsuya tende songutwa. Tane nyawar lembale shendo teba ni maise. Kete shena leme bar sonyu rena songdo mesera. Kete basa nyawar le shen maise. Tane nyawar lembale shendo teba ni maise. Tade sakche nyelengi pungbunga yorwa. Tele pe ngombo sebna shicheni yo mare songora. Tane nyawar lemba nyawar langja ke nyawar lemba sene nyawar lenje pungbunga botele pe ngo tade je ngombo sebna shi yo mare songora. Tane nyawar lemba le shendo teba ni maise. Ngombo sebna shi loga yona songora. Kete shena se kete shen be ngombo sebna shi je tada ane pungbunga pe loga yeba yina songora. Kete shena leme ba sonyu rena songdo mes. Ane ngazo ta ngon jinde zan yanda sokbo rechili ngazo chilo ta chingro jinde sokbo tongsuna o de tashi resha de tundu resha se pata gdwa. Balan reje tong tongsuna o de balan resha se de ta resha se pata gdwa. Ane sokbo de ta marwa go de ta marwa. Tele tende pa ta go mare se ra. Tele maden ba ngazo ta de charju so dakshi re ko do charshi re ko do. Yanda sokbo reje tong yana soso sem dachine soso sem ge chawara chicha nga kibudo kibudo yaguchonso so samchi tambuchi char korwa kangbare chane gegure chi thogare chi chala surji thone ane te kangbare cha sam korwa sa ta tene sokbo charwala to ko medwa se sem da chorwa ta tende cham kona khadulya ra khadu korande sokbo charwala to ko maro kona kare na te shendo ba ko loga yona kona kadul pangun je chena degre ba so ara kete nyale me shento kete shena le me ba so rena so do me phungbo so ala ma de bar ta kona khadu daga pango so ju yo ko re te so me do aso ra te buddha balita na le so yo ra lo ke ane kera dine da de be loga yona phungbo ngale lo so yona ane phungpunga de phungpunga bo kangru ji charwala tene ta go me do asara khadu koran de imbadel nguje de res je pa songurwa ti soye me do asara ti mebe to daro ko yena ko de ji sobo de sem de mare de res je ta ngone de pa nguje che tu ye ko ra ti yo mara kangbare jine kangbe chashere chi rewa chashere chi thone ni kangba se ur ma do kangba chashe ka ma thone kangba dire se logan ju se chi yo mara o ti sung yo do de sha ke de shena le me ba sung yu re na sung do me se dakshi de sung go so ala ma de ba ko na tare khatul se gra khatul ya thegar se ora thegar ya ngon jin ya yo ko re ti je me do ase o ti sung yo do ta ju ma ju ba da ta ju ka bla ti de sung do yeah, that didn't matter. Yeah.
So here again, as if it were the case that the self were essentially distinct, different from the aggregate, sort of like yellow and blue, we would also have this issue, as Nagarjuna describes. It is not correct for the self to be other than the appropriated aggregates. If it were, it could be apprehended without the appropriated aggregates, yet it is not. So here, if it were the case that somehow the self were totally different, other, separate from the aggregates, we would have to be able to apprehend it in the absence of any sort of aggregates. But we apprehend the self on the basis of some sort of the aggregates appearing to us. Like we see a particular form and think, oh, that's Tashi, or we see a particular form and think, oh, that's a cow. We need something that appears to the mind in order to be able to, on that basis, then designate a particular thing. And so here, if we are, say, talking about a house, you need to have some sort of element of that house, whether it's like the roof or the windows or the walls or the doors, that you then are able to point to and say, oh, that's a house. But if we have a self that is somehow not in relation at all to our form, our consciousness, our feelings, our discernment, our karmic formations, we would have to be able to directly apprehend that self apart from the aggregates without having any of those aggregates appear to mind, and then on that basis designate a self. We would have to have some sort of direct appearance. And so here, this is again, as Nagarjuna says, if it were other, if our self were somehow other than those aggregates, it could be apprehended without the aggregates. Yet it is not. We don't see any sort of self apart from the aggregates. And Buddha Palita too, in his own commentary, Buddha Palita, says that something needs to appear. One of the aggregates needs to appear for us to designate a self. There's no way that we can have a self in the absence of that basis of designation. But if it were the case that such a self existed essentially as different from the aggregate, sort of like yellow and blue, like something that's totally separate, then we should be able to apprehend such a self directly without the basis of any of the aggregates, without having any of those appear to us. And we can see that that is not the case, where there's no way that we can have some sort of apprehension of the self in the absence of the appropriated aggregates.
Oh yeah. What's what is it? Robin Dawa Trabaka, Sunguta, Omachaboka. Teacher Pumbu Leshan, Da Medes, Pumbungabule, by Lawson, or Tadeshane, Mombo 7 Shane, Das and gets a loga, your mare, Sungara. Teacher Pumbu Leshan, Da Medes. Pumbumado, Tinzima Druches. Da the Zindu, Pumbukan, Roaji Charne, and the Jiretare Shas, Pat Chargamato, Pumbukan, Machane, Korata, the Tiger. Kadulia and Gonzia Mido House from Guara. Tadi Beloga, and Kadul Gonzia, Yoga, Timido House from Guara. Tis a Pumbu Lesha Dame, the Pumbumato, Tinzima Tuches. Pumbu Songa Mato, but Takona Gonzia Mido House. Tagisana City. Tadi Kologa, and Kotega Kadu Janjalia. Pumbu Songa Tego, Maro, Koran Kadu Kanye, but the Zuzun did it, Lesson Yogurati or Mara. Penangazo Cambaricina. Godang Kegung, the Togachi, Sudachi Tone, and the Kambari Svatantrika. The Kambadi Koda Kegung, the Toga, Zibata, Logayana, and the Kambadi says Loga Kambang Zichora, teacher Yomara. So they said they or the Tanga Kambana Day Sudua, the Janjan the Kamboke Barua. Chizako Chasher of Chisoni, Kambas of the correspondence and all things of Kambades. Dagdua. Kokoran the Kamba Maride. That call a loss of Kambachus did pass on the Kambashan Yomara. Then the Tagiora, Koran Mainga Kassil Ten and teaches it and Tagasha do the matter. That Tele Lag was a Kambachan and Riot Yomare. Then I said, that is somebody. What is your lamna? Matter.
So in the same way, Chandrakirti says in his commentary on the Middle Way that therefore there is no self other than the aggregates, because without the aggregates, it is not apprehended. So there's no way that we can apprehend the self without any of the aggregates. If we set all of those aside and have some sort of, there's no way to have like a direct, unmediated apprehension of the self in the absence of those aggregates. If we set all all of them aside. There's nothing that we can identify or actually apprehend as the self apart from those aggregates. So here, if it were the case that such a self did exist within the aggregates, it would have to be, apart from the aggregates, it would have to be identifiable. We would have to be able to point to it apart from the aggregates. But in reality, it is on the basis of those aggregates that we designate a self, but it's not somehow findable outside of those or even within those. So here, like the example of a house, if we, it is on the basis of seeing the various things like windows and doors and walls and roof and so forth that we say, oh, that's a house. But if we were to try to point to, well, is the house the door? No, the house isn't just the door, but it's designated on the basis of those various parts when they're in aggregation. But is there something that is a house apart from all of those various parts? Well, no, you can't posit some kind of house that is separate from, totally distinct from all of those various parts. And so too, it is with our aggregates and our self. The self can't appear to us or be apprehended in the absence of the aggregates.
Oh yeah, that Nambungara da Shera. So the round that is some locodo. I should do so would accept that so to and del make so United Shagdoa. Round Shagdoa. Shanda Lepa, the Chijiri, the Mama Reslepa, Tapas and Maiba, so Yanchik, Tuktobachi, so Taxeba, Taxation, Nade Yotos, Zetan, Tantaya Yobarachi. Nangarangi Yos, Tinga Sobor, Dinga Assembly, Titson, Nangarangi Yos, some sort of single or Tirida, Rangone Yobasida, Nakorangi Yoba, Rawando Yoba, Ranshiji Yoba, Ranging Oyo Yobasida. In the Tembaruba, Siguritaria, Tembaruba, Narazu Sambana, Tembaruba. The Rawando Trubasa. Oh, Tindidi, Mindusam Guara, Ramawe Tachi, and the Pumbunga the chief to Chene Medua, Pay Loga Chene Medua. Yana Kongabu to the Yana, more chick, some chick, Yana, more Tades and Yoko, the Ramawe to the Korazukanga Nati, Ramawe to the Truce, to Yokora. Yogura, Timidoa, something, do round with art the Midoa, some gorta. Sobolia, Sosa Sobolia, Namju Sosa some day, Nas, round, which is Rangatunge, Sosa Chiku Tumge, some locodoa, or Tindring at the Yoma, rest, Tindring around at the Yona, and then Pumbungabudan, Chicken and Duga, Ya Pumbungabula loss and Duga, Chicken, Mindoa taking Lapsara, Pumbungale loss, Pay Loga, and Drumedoa. And the Pumbi Chawa Cheba, Dark Chawa Cheba membership, Dark or Loga Chawa Changas Kudoa, Timidua. Or Tindu, I want to but Medosam. Tarangin and Medosam. Pumbula, Tangent, Del, Nepatasha, what some race awesome. Tangent, Deber is a Wasudua. Koram Mainga Sasha Mambola, and then Dogshig Lola, Tedan Del, and then the Maris, Tanya, Tagasha, and Mato. Ngaranju Nambulo, Narasambanashi, Nangarangi, some Tutu, Tausi, Chess, Munzici, some Locoda, or Tender, now we are not Mendo, some Gora. Tina and Nanzin Chodra, Soso Yadante. Pumbunga, Tenepa, Tati, some day, Pumbunga, Chawache, the Taga Chawachigora, Sobo Nasuna, Nagatus, Sobo Tevun, Takibu, Nagatus, or Tender, Ruchi Mado. Tassing Nageta Chishi, which is Loga came into a loss of Medoango. Oh, Tina, any contract here that doesn't know do your tongue, and so can't go on setting a Yogara or Mount us. What that is love, then do that.
So normally we have this kind of sense of I, this thought of I, this sense of a self that is not dependent upon anything else. It's not dependent upon our mentally designating it on the basis of those aggregates, but rather it has this sense that we have this autonomous I that's set up from its own side, that has kind of an autonomous existence, that is really truly established, that's inherently existent or ultimately existent. as unable to bear the kind of rational analysis that we engage in. And so once we have the sense of that I, that as it normally appears to us, we begin to say, well, if it were to exist as it appears, then it's either got to be the same as our aggregates, somehow identifiable within those, or separate from the aggregates. So when we search for such as kind of like self-sufficient, autonomously established self, we can conclude that such a self doesn't exist. It can't be existent in the way that it appears to us. It's not something that is totally separate from the aggregates, because then we would fall into this issue that whatever the aggregates are doing, the self is not doing that. There's all sorts of fallacies that incur from that. And on the other hand, if the aggregates are essentially the self, then we fall into other sorts of issues. So this self that appears to us as established from its own side, like set up by itself without being contingent or dependent upon anything else, is not something that can exist, but rather this self that we apprehend is something that is merely designated on the basis of these aggregates. And those aggregates are dependent upon causes and conditions and their various parts and so forth. And therefore, there's nothing that is like has this sort of autonomous existence. This self is dependent upon our mental designation and being dependently originated and so forth. And so although we want to find like some kind of self that is able to bear analysis, once we engage in this kind of analysis, we find that such a self doesn't exist as it appears to us with this kind of autonomy and independence and ability to act on its own. But rather we come to see that when we say like, I'm sick or I'm angry and so forth, that I is not really existent in the way that it appears to us. It's something that's merely designated on a basis. And this kind of understanding is incredibly powerful at reducing our grasping at a self. When we have this kind of understanding, the sort of grasping at a self and the afflictions that arise from that are reduced.
Oh yeah. Oh, don't have to ditch it. I'm not able to do. The Uma Juboka, that's suggested. Nemo Chana Malun Jisola sa. Nemo Bala so bata, and a teacher Kega Nasila soba Koetonga Yorba. Nemo Chana Malun Jisola sa. Tale Songa Loy Tonjonese. Nemo Bata, Dioange Leas and the Kega Nasila soba Tonga and the Kanga. Sawa de Caresana, Yamochana Malu, Jisola, Tales, and a lawyer tongue Nesera. Jiso shouldn't jibber and she change Pumbunga de Sigara. Pumbunga de Sobo in the Seminara Kanga, Judan Kialetene, and a thunder conjure do it and gets ready or talk about temper trouble in the Kemara. Keji in jibber and she change talk about Pumbunga, talk about the last Sigora. Yamochana Malun Jisola. O Telia Caridos and the Tina Lola Tas Rawa Rangzu Tuba, Rangja Tuba, Tandigajar. O Tina Lola Tas Sutuba, Ranguna Yoba, Nangaranga Yus and get it in this Amlisitua. Yamochana Malun Jisola, Jibber and Shichan Pumbunga and Yosatingama to Yomartin, Jibber and Shichan. Kunal Takbatamba Yonach the Yomara, Taina Garazu Samlunalia, Tinalia, Pumbunga, Jibber and Shinche, Kitchi, and Joan the Canrete, Kendalangate, Rawan to Tubashi, Samgora, Yumochona, Malu, Jisola, Rawa, Tayo, Batawa, take Yongora, Sungora, Yumochona, Malu, Jisola, Talechongas, Loy Tonjur Nese, Tiaco, Sungora, Yumochona, Malu, Jisola. Tar society Rangwa Yoba Samloko, or Tiwanga, and education Bushibuchi, and a nice education Bushibuchi, and it Tawada Tungi, Toyatodalia, Land Ramanda Kangasa Yugura, but in Yamochana Malu Jisola, Tale Choase, Tawam, Tindesambal, Tenechuante, Loy Shebachen, and Sogura. Yamochana Malu Jisola, Tale Cholota. Tan indeed you to Toshen. Oh, Pumbu Jibber and Shichin Pumanga, Raya Tayo, but Tagiore, Tikaril Tagioresana, The Tanya to Yebangarazu Dade, Sosote la Mini, Titi, ne Rave time, but Tagio Resungora. Tani di you to touch and I said, Tade, the Tanya to Yebetade, Gandu, you take with Chawach and get Achora. Oh, Tilia Mini, Sungora, Tani, di Migbe you to talk about Chanes. Tell a Mini, and Rave Taji. Sobole Pungunga and a lawsuit, Rave, you some or Resungora. Tani di you to say, Tanya to Yebetade. The Jigati Mikbach and tell me, and the Tade Rawa, and got the Rawa Chivatagio Resungora. Yamachona Malunji Sola Talis or Lotonjane. Tani di you to touch and then Nazuba, what did Tade Gogio Resora? Rawa Tade. TV Homa Res and Azulo Hangil Tedeshiva Mado, T Homa Res, Timab the Tadingazu Pungunal Rawa Tadiana. Punguda Chidu or Tade to your Sebashan, Medua Timedita, Rawe Tade, Pungulia Rawe Tade, Mava Tachura, Tomba Comgo, or Digilana.
So here, then it continues. Chandrakirti has a quotation from his commentary on the Middle Way that says that all of our afflictions and all of our various faults come from this view of the perishable collection. And it is by seeing, we are actually observing our merely conventionally existent self, but we ascribe this level of kind of autonomous existence to that. And this view, this wrong view, is what leads to all of the various faults. All of our afflictions arise from that, as well as all of the faults of birth, aging, sickness, and death, all of the various sufferings that we experience. And so here we, the aggregates, as it says in this view of the perishable collection, the aggregates are dependent upon causes and conditions. They aren't something that is like static and fixed, but rather are changing moment to moment. And if it were the case that such a self existed from its own side with this sort of autonomous existence, that sort of contradicts the way that we can see our actual aggregates exist. But when we have this sort of sense in our mind of there being a really truly autonomously existent self, then we have this sense of I and this sense of mine, and that strong grasping at a self, that strong self-cherishing arises from that. So it is, although there's only a conventionally existent self, something that is merely designated on the basis of those aggregates, we instead take there to be, in our mind, there appears to be an autonomously, like as a self that is existent from its own side without being dependent upon any sort of causes and conditions or our mental designation. And when we think that such a self is really truly existent, again, we give in to this kind of self-cherishing and self-grasping and so forth. So we need to begin then by observing this self as it appears to us, as having this kind of autonomous, independent existence that is not contingent upon any sort of cause or condition, parts, or our mental labeling of it. And it's when we're able to identify that, we then can engage in this analysis. Well, so is such a self the same as the aggregates, or is it essentially different from the aggregates and so forth?
Oh, yeah. Well, do you do Kasha? Najo by a tan and go what it says, or Titabu Tata, and then Najo Baga Raw. Oh, Tini Pangogores, Mabati Shimbachagores, Jusayang Dalatene, Chick to Jealous over Jusayang Dalton, Shibachagores, Oda. Oh, T. Duty. Nature by a ton and go what says, Pacago race. And the tie get under Teconani the Zago race, Teconani the Caretza was in a shirab Jitzago race. Shirab Jitza and any chick that had a candle mabaton any time and do some shago race on Godoa. Oh, Tinashi, only the number that is wake up some Godoa. Logdo de Coyudi, Logdo de Washington Basha. Since you lot of Washington Basha, did somebody say, Yo, my race and pa, Mabashim Bashagora. The castle. Then you buy a ton and go by chase and she gabale, you go to the Sunjum Heban, the table and the new Maesa. Loto Karina, Chinjilo, the Hako, and Zen, the Hakoba share. Tin Zimbana said, Mendo, Sesapa, Meba, Shebache, or the Songora. The Karesana, not do you get Tanda Hashangi, Tanda Pecha de Samko, the Hashan, the Sabachon, the Kamalashila, Sambarava, Kumrimde, or the Samko Karesana, Hashan to some Karesana. You to go so try to recite to tone and assembly. Yomoke Kanga Chigito, you to Machina Yavores and a child young Maris and Biora. Chia Yela Michibasidua. Chia Yela Machina Yagri, but the Yela Chena called Yomo Condronga Kanga Chiguara. Yela Machesh, Kake Salomata, Tani Yavores and Biora. Tis Samlo Mambo Yore. Chirba Toge Mambo. Things to do some Namgata said the suit of the Kanga Salomata, Namga Chanjata. Namshe should do tear Salomata at the same time. Chia may samsa. You to the Sudachin, you to Chichido subject. Call Salomatana Yagare Copa, San Salomatana Yagare Sigora. Chia Yela Meshiba Comgore Mato, Chimbata, Chudim Sum Saba Com Shade, Tawahama go get to Samlatanta Rese. Tawa Mago to any Chudim Son, any middle hada Tabali Kekueta, Roa, Simbaton, the launches Jueta, Tendrece to see what they call over the Sigora. There's a congregation and call over it. Tawa Shen said, See, I yell myself, second, some Lomatans, 60 take thoughts of the Penguara. Whereas the Midashina, Tawashina, Cotton, Contra Cotan Maton, the years at Tana, Cotos, Thousand got a penguin, Katuta, the Tigmara, in a town and map at the Suyo Mara. She's a coinji Miji. Log, the hack on the Tiba Shemba, said, T. Remedos, T. Shimaba hack on the Comnia, Yamot Sawan and Palm so a tapsi show the mother. And Negapsi do Scat and the Peng Mara. Penetrated Tabguna tried to meet there, I was an equally a Tabgura. Tidin Yamo, Chinjulo, and Titan, some good or Titan, Raymond, or some Pami, 10 party children, to me, some jet and drink Mara. Trajum good on Dako Tragus, Miss Sumja, Matan Den Pemara. Or Tina, she says, Miss Sumbata, Sidu Mare, Chinjulo, Lotti, young Taba, the Chinjulo, in by the Shempa, the Mares and Maba, the Congo, good Esungua. Or Tichilumna, yeah.
So here, continuing sort of my rendition of the quotation from Chandrakirti, he continues by saying that the yogi, the meditator, refutes the existence of such a self, coming to recognize that such a self as it appears to us, as it with sort of an autonomous kind of existence, the yogi, the meditator, actually comes to realize the lack of that it can't exist in such a way. And so coming to understand suchness, this ultimate reality, depends upon our first recognizing the wrong view. So we need to first be able to understand the way in which we are viewing things incorrectly, and then be able to understand that say the self as it appears to us doesn't actually exist in that way. We understand the lack of such a self through that kind of rational analysis. Now, again, this text by Kamalashila was written for the purpose of refuting the view of someone like Hashang Mahayana, who said that, well, the problem is that when we engage in these various objects, our objects of the senses and so forth, then we give rise to all kinds of afflictions. So if we are to disengage from those objects and cultivate these kinds of states of meditation, like the sort of higher concentrations, things like endless space and endless consciousness and nothingness, where there's nothing appearing to the mind, he says, well, then you're not going to give rise to all of those afflictions. If you disengage from those objects, then you have eliminated that kind of wrong thinking. Well, of course, this is really just a sort of temporary solution. This is the view of someone who has no proper understanding of the view, that thinking that all faults just come from engagement with objects, and so therefore disengaging is going to solve the problem. It's like sort of thinking, well, if you have an enemy, you can get rid of your enmity toward that person by just like not looking at them or not thinking about them. And while that may temporarily work to be able to say, prevent you from giving rise to afflictions with regard to that enemy, you're not going to be able to really uproot that or that sense of them being an enemy until you realize the opposite, until you get rid of that wrong view. So to temporarily sort of suppress our afflictions by, it's almost like just closing your eyes and disengaging, just sort of closing your eyes, not looking, I'm not going to engage. That is only really a temporary solution. But in order to be able to get rid of this wrong view, we have to realize the lack of such a self. We have to realize the opposite of the way that we are continually and normally grasping.
Oh yeah, obviously. Well, Tangazuya Dichi Tos Shena Samgiba. Not under Tongbanita or the Pakadusa, Kebasu Sunzu Medata Singuara. Oh, that under Chiaila Mejeba Sumbana Shicha, Chitampa Kayate, Tandangazuta de Shedusa, Rae Tade Kavio Resonsa, Tade Kavio Marva, Chita Tanya to Yube Tade Kavio Mara, till a New York. Tongba Sudan, so me, Tame, Trimes, Tomba Comgores, Ta Maba Comgores, and Gichiore. Tongba Sutires, Rangshin Korayo, so Maba Comgores. Roa. Kabakashison, Tanda de Chetonga Bada to the Sona, Marete, Rawado Truba, Ranguna Truba. Tanjik, then get Tanya Joangi, get turned down by the Mayanos, and so me, Tame Kanga Mes, so to us, Donalia. Shirani becomes a chetam Rangshin, Tomba number Yanda, which is a Taos, and so me Tame Songuara. A Tanda Decapsua, the Kaksam Merchant, the Talaka. Kasangaju long trump in Samjua. Telataji Chawanes, Lobin Devi Kasara. The Ram Meba, the Tenatani, your Maes, the Lobin Pabal, Shigabek of Sondua. The Ram Meba, the Tenatani, your Maes. Should some around to draw your Marites and Drelne and Telepatas of Sachiris of Gara. Satade Tina Series and the Ram Meba, the Tenatani, your Maes, Ram Tati, your Mares on Gudwa. T. Rebecca, Lobin de Dawatabo, Shigab and Rebecca. Telataji Sawane, Kanshing over Namjashala, Ragmale, Bangor, and Shinte, Temeba, Tameba also. So Tame said, Tado Tiradas, Chetamja Tames, Chetamja Gitani, the Yomares, Kariomaras, Chetamja Gitani, the Shala Tess and Drell, any Lopata was some shower matter, any Kasra. Telata Kashing over them Shala, Ragmalebango, Ramado Truba, Rangjatuba, Rangsu Tuba, Rangina Truba, the Yomares of Dwa. Kashing over them Shala, Ramalebango, Rashite, Tamebos. So Chetamje Gitani de Rawando Trubetani, Yomares, Telech Tame Basevore, Songudwa. Oh, the Indizan Cochina Tame Basemares, Tita, the long Kunda transfer, Kashe or Lamdi Semenangeti, Getchembures and Bivaya to the Kum, long Tende or Res at Tandalia. Chidan or Titakin Nashire, Chiayela Mejebata, Yata Koraka Gore, Ta Yomare, Ramabeta Sagomare. Takora Yomare, Rawe Su Segomare, Sukora Tongba Kogore. Tonya de Pakasang said the loss of Kores and Sungache, the Kasang loss Komare, Sungakani Yora, Kabatu Shifu Medra Yore. Kapsas Pakaya Tongbani said the Tongre, Kapsade, Nazuton de Samakaya Mares, Nazuton de the now and Nanshin Temper Mebaka, Nazo Nadusa Rawan to Truba Rangun to Nagura. Now and she, you by the cow or mother, called Shawach and get you order. The what don't can get you order, so try to raise a Shawach and get legacy and get you the order, then she driven to watch some legacy order. Round to a man, I see my Indian covered sauce to do and Shawach and get you orders, take I your mother, Sugora. Kamakas notice about Kaya Kangapa Kasha goddess. The Magana cheese some that don't say that any Yamokanga can tell you goddess. Kakashana, Yaharese, Kasha loss of music called Marese. Kasha loss of music called it, Kuntran, Dolet and dress on the Ase, and then Pagbalet and dress on the Ludruk and dress on the Ase, and Kajamunzi Kobe Kuntus Kangatrangi. Tin and a Kashashi to Thursday, some tanking netos care. Or dinner need to turn, but it Silone Audwa. They are the Angi Tambutin and the Sholi Tambuchi or the Takeran the machine. The Darian Shigaba and Jebal Eserdoa, Shigaba de Lobin Pakbal and Zerwa, Tijeba de Lobin Dawata Zerwa, the Shigaba and Jebale. This is the regret number Cheba and Answerdoa. Oh, regret taxes, one chick to your Tade to your reserve, turn number Yona, Tale Chigribe, Shanle Chigribe, Nigale Chigre, Chumile Chigres, taxation and Mabuka Yorno, or this Gura. Teacher, the regret number Chebana, anyone will make you on boat, only you so that you Rachel Sovata, number Sheba, number Ya, Yuben, maybe as a Shabbat. Tasu but says about you and a Koraya, you or a team in do Asungura. Raya made reason. Number Shiba number Yuben, maybe as a Dr. Jena Raya Yomaris. Ranking oil to by meadows. Ranking oil to by the Yomaris, ranking oil to by the Kagoresungura. Getting dinam, ranking oil to by the Yunanis. Getting sure the Kanga ranking oil to Guyana. Rangshinji to Guyana, Korang, so to Yachuna. Getting dinam ranking oil to by Junani. There's a table number Chebanasa. Tetu Jirigbe. Taxation, the Gangas to touch on chick to your Tade or extended chess one. Oil to by meadows, taking oil to by the Ragma, Resungura. Getting dinam ranking oil to by Junani. There's a table number Chebana. Chesa or Chita neighbor, oil, make by Washington. Doctor said, ranking oil, Yona, Rawan to Bachuyana. That doctor said this on Dagi Pumbungada, law success on Tade, or Tinasi said this on Raya Yogores, Rawan to Bachuyana. The Raya Yomarati, the Tibaka Gores, Rawan to Tubaka Yores, Sungura. Chitane Bango, Yavan to me, but Juna. Me by my days, this is Rangshinji Tongo Shechawa Tubos. So Rangshinji Tube Tomba to Gurmado, Ngobokora Kanga Tomba to Gumare Sungura. Oh, did you Lamna Rob such?
No. So here then, when we are talking about emptiness and discussing this notion of emptiness, we're talking about an emptiness or a lack of this kind of true existence or sort of autonomous self, unlike the kind of understanding of those who would say that we just need to sort of disengage, stop anything from appearing to mind, and they advocate for engaging in these kinds of higher meditative concentrations in which one doesn't engage with any sort of desire realm object. That sort of understanding is incorrect here. What we're talking about is a lack of true existence or a lack of inherent existence. So as, and again, based upon Chandrakirti's commentary to Arya Deva's 400 verses, we see that here he explains that our analysis is intent upon seeking intrinsic nature. So here, when we say have like in the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, where it says that there's no form, no feelings, no discrimination, no consciousness, and so forth, and is going through that, it's not declaring that there is no form whatsoever, or that there are no feelings whatsoever. It's not refuting the conventional existence of these phenomena, but rather their existence as sort of with this kind of autonomy or from their own side. So here, this is the sort of understanding that we need to have, that when these things, when such a self or such existence is being refuted, it is not refuting the conventional existence of phenomena. So there's sort of and two kinds of views here, one in which we are careful to distinguish between the kind of existence that is autonomous or not dependent or contingent, like set up from its own side, but not sort of general existence. We are not refuting actions and feelings and so forth, but inherently existent or truly existent kinds of actions and feelings and so forth. Whereas the view of Hashang Mahayana would be that if one were to engage at all with those sorts of mental objects, then that would sort of lead to our grasping at them rather than understanding the sort of misapprehension as being the problem here. So as Chandrakirti says in his commentary to the 400 stanzas or 400 verses, therefore, when reason analyzes in this way, there is no essential nature that exists in the sensory faculties, objects, or consciousnesses. Hence, they have no essential existence. If they essentially existed, then their analysis by reason, then under analysis by reason, their status as essentially existent would be seen even more clearly, but it is not. Therefore, they are established as empty of intrinsic existence. If it were the case that upon this kind of analysis, we were to see things more clearly, or they were to become more apparent to us, then it would be the case that they did exist in that way. But that's not the case. Rather, through this sort of analysis, we come to establish that they are empty of any such intrinsic nature.
Oh, yeah. Then the chilo never. The regret just so much get turn is now do. Tanda Dala Sabata Chebachidoa, Chebachido, Tandam to Madula Chebachiora, Chebachido Sanchez, and a Raya, your mother. Tinde Chebachin, Tekonani, regret Chebachin, Raya, Yona, and it's Jesu to Truba Sigara. Regret Chesuba, Jesu to Truba, Tasu to Truba Sigara. So Tinde Tadi Tagi Rama, Tadi, Yema Taswa, and Chigda Tade Kandu, Yema, Tinde Tadisa Raumedua. Timeduko Jesu to Mare, Tadi, Tekonanila Chebe, Rebesiana Raya Yomare, Jesu to Madu, Tasu to Madu Sigdoa, or did on that the Songdoa. Denicasa, Rebet Jesu, Messu get earnest, Tekonanila Chebe, Rebeti, Niemani in Lase, Tekonanila Chebe, Rebeti, Sani Chiragadona, Tekonani to Truva, Tamba Truva, Tamba Truva, Resa, Tini Medona, and it's a Messobare. Tamba Truba Mare, the Mangone, Rawatu to a Maber, Esungora. Timbe Kundi Shijab and Revalese, Loban Dawata was Shijab and Revale. Coach a number Chebane, Ranjin, so a Lurcheba Nigicher. She said the Yorata, the Pumura Chigmare, Tade Mare, Chichevera, Keva de Tale, Kigmare, Shanle, Kigmare, Nugari, Gimele, Kigmare, Sechu, and Chipaka de Yora. The Kari Sechu Chigora, Karika Gura, Sanasungura. Coach a number Chebane, Ranshin, so a Lurcheba Nigicheros. Rangune Truba, Ranshin, Korang, Ranshin, Truba. Shandala Thursday, Journey, Chema, Church, Tony Trumba Gunga. Koran Ranshin, so you then get it, or Esera. Coach a number Chebane, Ranshin, so a Lurcheba Nigichero, or this ocean Segurese. Shesonbada Sosola, Gengala Soba, Ranshinji Yoba Choa de Mato. Sukora Segomar, Takora Segomar, Tacha Yomare. Not just go to Sagado, Tongo, Drogo, Tego, Tanyo, Tongan, Haku, Tanya do you better, the Shingatua. Take away your set Segomare. In Salaris, Laning, Azuran, Cabando, and Raya or what Timara. Tas a patane. Let talk about some mare, Pumbuga, let talk about some mare, Korayan, get it, Basili orders, and get you, and talk about those Segura. Tekonani to Tumba to Segura. Oh, this one better. Ranshin so this one, Sumba the Sula sobe, Kangala sobe, Ranshin you met Sugures, Ranshin you Truba you met Sugures. Tedana Sula sobe, ranking over to be Kanga you may, Sawa Ingi. Everybody Kanga some go Minos. Oh, dear. Rangi Moe to be Kanga Saver Matoti, Chitaka yo Maran Kaba yo Mares, Sungu Mata yo Mares, Tika yo Maresera. What is you to know?
So here we are getting at the sort of point that nothing is able to bear this kind of rational analysis. There's nothing that can be found when we search ultimately or searching for sort of investigating the nature of reality. There's as it says here in the topic heading that we're reading from in the Lam Rim is, you cannot eradicate conventional phenomena by refuting them through investigating whether whether they are capable of withstanding rational analysis. So the idea of something being able to withstand rational analysis is it would have to truly exist or inherently exist. If we were able to find something upon that kind of rational analysis or investigation, then it would have to have this sort of ultimate existence. So it says here then, to ask whether something can withstand rational analysis is to ask whether it is found by a line of reasoning that analyzes reality. And so Chandrakirti's commentary to the 400 verses says, because our analysis is intent upon seeking intrinsic nature. So here, when we are really engaging in this kind of investigation and analysis, we are looking for something that has this sort of intrinsic nature. So this is seeking to discover whether forms and so forth have an intrinsic nature that is produced, ceases, and so forth. Thus, the analysis searches to see whether forms and so forth have production and cessation that exist essentially. It is not that this line of reasoning is searches for mere production and cessation. So here, this kind of line of inquiry where one is investigating ultimate reality, the unfindability of phenomena of those of that kind of existence doesn't negate the mere existence, like we are able to sort of logically say in the world, I'm going, I'm sitting, I'm eating, and so forth. And that level of reality is not sort of undermined by this kind of rational analysis. But if we were to search for such a self, well, what is the self that is sitting or eating or doing those kinds of things? We're searching for a self that has some kind of essential or intrinsic nature. And the unfindability of that doesn't undermine the conventional existence of such a self. But if it were the case that there was something beyond our mere designation, something that is merely designated by mind, then it would have to be findable under this kind of reasoning. So it's not about whether something exists at all, but rather about whether it exists essentially.
Oh yeah, that's it. Then you did your lotion, a touch of body. The she gave and Jabba Lovin Dawatra Sungwa. Cause I get number 2 Vanessa. That you met on Kewa, you made a Chevachen, Sawashirabla Soba Tezuka Sumabukagi or what is a Sungura. Cause I get number 2 Vanessa, Ranshin Sova Lurchebangis. Ranshin Truba, Ranging Truba, Temba Truba Chiana. Take our dose as a tell you or a tea or Mares, take a giorno. Coachane, didn't open a Ranging Truba Gorgis and go ahead the Karaka Gurasana, Ranging Truba, Temba Truba, Tandamba Truba, Rawando Truba, or Dipaka Gioresa. Ranging Truba Gorgi, Mila Soba Chesh, Tension Jabra, legend number member Mango Gosa. Mila Soba Jutan Kengi Chever, Tension Jabra, Yabare, Chawachen Gure. Te legend number member, take a your Marisura. Legend number member Mango Gosa. Oh, this is yeah.
So in a similar vein, also from Chandrakirti's commentary to the 400 stanzas, and this is in the third volume of this Lamrim Chenmo, it's on page 160, where it says in this sort of back and forth between an objector and then us replying, it says, because our analysis is intent upon seeking intrinsic nature. So here, we're not sort of refuting the refutation of just the existence of, say, to go from above. If eyes and such do not exist, then how can sensory faculties of organs, such as the eye, be considered things that result from karma? And so would we refute that it is the nature of these to result from karma? And the objector then comes back, since you are demonstrating the refutation of eyes and such, how could you not refute that? So here it's making clear in the reply, because our analysis is intent upon seeking intrinsic nature, we refute here that that things exist essentially. We do not refute that eyes and such are products and are dependently arisen results of karma. Therefore, they exist. Hence, when eyes and such are explained only as results of karma, they do exist. So here, what's being refuted is some kind of inherent or true or real existence. It's not sort of undermining or refuting the mere existence of, say, our sensory organs and so forth, and that they are arisen from karma. It's not undermining the mere causality or them existing as dependent originations, but rather this kind of analysis is refuting an intrinsic nature.
Oh yeah. Tadi shijeba pabalaga de tsawekap sungutwa. Dikun rawa meba de tena tane yo mayese. Chun de sama tamje rawa tu truba yo marese. Te chen del ne lo pa takba sam shawo ma do. Rawa tu truba chi yo marese. Dikun rawa meba de. Tena tane yo mayese chö tamje ge tani. Chö tamje da meba yin so ede. Chö tamje ge tani rawa tu truba tani tu yo mare. Sama tenje debar chwa lo fa tene takba samla sha ko ba cha res ti song go ra de go rawa me ba de tene ta ne yo ma yin se ti deba shi je ben deba da ta ba kar so do sana de na rang ge ngo da se rang ge ngo yo tu ba da so ra rang shin gi tu ba se rawa da se rawa do tu ba se shan la rag ma le ba se de shan la rag ma le ba ngo de la ta me ba so so to shan la rag ma le ba ka yin ba Shanla ra male ba yimba tela ne she te o to zu kanga nam jang chikba de se so don da ba tu ba tam ba tu ra wa tu ba shanla ra male ba tu ba tu chikba de o ti me ba tele ya che tam je ge ta me se che tam je ra wa tu ba ta ni tu me se ten jin de ba ju ra she de se te song go re song do o de ya ta shanla ra male ba se de kare song go re se na de che song ga ba she ba chung go do Tela shala rama leba sheba nese, Gyujin shala rama leba mayin jese, Yujen tanyebe sheba la shense chade ese, Yujen tanyebe sheba de respa tangen lochi warwa, Dakshi chile tene, Chashe chile tene pan de respa tangen lochi le songora, Dena rangi, Gyujin shala rama leba la se maris, Tila labshagirno, Gyujin shala rama leba, Rale bengo yo marisen te to le la bra te se mare sungora Gyujin shala ra male ba mayin ge se yujen tanye be she ba la shen se chalas yujen tanye ge de mare se tanye se de la dai tanye da lo tanye se ni sha gra ra de kaga ha ko ya o de chok se da de khang ba da de mere da de ta re da se kaga ye wa she ta da sungora de ming de la jitang ge tanya se gore ming de che so le de re sam ge de lo tanya se gore o jna o de ka sura shala rama le be de tela shala rama le ba che ba ne gyujin shala rama le ba ma yin ge se yujen tanya be she ba la shen shi shala de wang ge sha ba min be de la ya de wang ge sha ba min be Shala Rama le ba se ore. Te wange shakba maimba ane yu korane ne tsui chi yu na. Ane Shala Rama le be ngoho yu wa se kare sung do. Ya odi Gantu muto.
So then next from the root verses of Arya Deva's 400 stanzas, and again, this is quoted in Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, the English translation, page 212, where it says that for Arya Deva's 400 stanzas says, all of this is without its own power. Therefore, there is no self. So here, what is being refuted in terms of our understanding of selflessness is this kind of autonomy, and not just autonomy in terms of not being dependent upon causes and conditions, but autonomy in the sense of not being dependent upon our mental designation, not being dependent upon our mental labeling or designating things. And so here, then commenting on this, Chandrakirti says in his commentary to the 400 stanzas, It is that which exists essentially, intrinsically, autonomously, and without depending on another. So these are all sort of synonyms. Is existing essentially, intrinsically, autonomously from its own side without depending on another. These are all terms for the same kind of existence. So without depending on another does not mean not depending on causes and conditions. But here we are referring instead to not depending on an other, meaning not is referring to a subject, i.e. a conventional consciousness, and something is said to not depend on another due to not being posited through the force of that conventional consciousness. So here it's essential that we recognize that this is referring to the level of dependency that includes our mental labeling or mentally designating something. So when we are talking about a sort of conventional consciousness, we can talk about conventions in terms of words, in terms of like the terms that we give to things, or the sort of conventional a mind, in which we sort of say this is this. We're differentiating things and sort of labeling or putting a name on a particular object with our mind. That's a conventional consciousness. So to assert some kind of existence which is separate from that or not dependent on that force of conventional consciousness, this is the type of existence which is being refuted.
Oh yeah, that is that dish Jabba Sawaraba, Pavala. Oh, she Jabba less. Kala Tene Chung Yuba Sudo, Tashi Kala Tene Chua, Taxila Tene Dogzigi Tene Tawala Tene Chua, Te Sunguyodo, Kala Tene Chung Yuba. Tene Ram in Euroso, to the church of the round to Trubati Yungumare Sungura. The good Ram Meba de Tenatana Yuma Insa. Should the summertime Ram Meba, round to Trubamare, Thursday Delne Truba Shajire. Tenatana Yuma Isa, Tenachatam Da Meba say, what Telesungura Sungura, Tenatana Yuma Insa. Oh, she so says. Then Dreba legend did the door. Dinner ranking all the Ranshinta, Rawada, Shala Ramaleba by Telane, Rale to be attention Drebra, Yuba Mainas or Rawan to be an attention Drebra Rungumares. Duce Tamjan attention Drebra in Besena, and the Rawan to be Yungumares Sungura. Duce Karina Churk conditioner, Korang Chasher, Maiga Chasher Tangura, Teleten any Balu Patane, Taga Chasha Judamato. That's I'm just simple. Talk about thousands of true good matter. That under the show, Nasha, using when it's an arrival matter. All teach learn and negotiation.
So then another quotation from Aryadeva's 400 stanzas, again quoted in the Lamrim Chenmo, the English page 317. He says, that which arises dependently does not exist autonomously. All of these things lack autonomous existence. Therefore, they have no self. And Chandrakirti's commentary to this then says, that which has its own essence, intrinsic nature, autonomy, or independence from others is self-existent and thus is not a dependent arising. So all compounded phenomena are dependent arisings. So anything that is a dependent arising is not autonomous because it is produced in dependence on causes and conditions, and therefore all things lack autonomy. There's nothing that has this kind of self or that is this intrinsic nature. So again, here, that which arises dependently and both in terms of causes and conditions, as well as our mental labeling or mentally designating that, all of that does not have some sort of autonomous existence. And because all things lack autonomous existence, therefore they have no self. So what we're talking about in terms of a self is some kind of essence, intrinsic nature, autonomy, or independence from others that would mean that it's not a dependent arising.
Oh yeah, that is a tongue of the Shigeba Marakasa. Oh, the Davinda Casa. Kumrim de low in the Kasi something about. Oh. Oh yeah, that is. Kansani Pumbula Sobango, Nijamai, Pumbula Sobateda, and Medabata to me, Moy in Beshir. 간사네 딱바다 직부 ngō yinpari shenda ki takbe chiro se. Tati tanda de kansa tena tamba truba de kagi ordon. Te kadu san ko chiriba ke tena tamba truba dugu yore, tamba truba dugu yore, nangba le ngoba mawa mabu chigi tamba truba da tena tamba truba dugu yordon. Tesu timu chene pa kakba chigidwa. Wati yindu san, pungbu la sokba te tani midakba da tume ngō yinpe chirse. Kansa ne tak바다 집이 ngōni yinpari shenda ji takbe chiro se shenda chiriba tu zuka tinte chota to songyora chiriba liya songyora ta de phungbu de ta re mare kera chana phungbu tu zukanga ene midakbada keji gyurwe sengi chen chashe mabu yongere do kera da de takba chibu chamil dugyo ba se phungbu ta yinpari ngumare ste chiriba lo songdo tinte basha
So then turning back to Kamalashila's text and where we had left off last time. So here we should analyze in the following kind of a manner. A person is not sort of separate from the mental and physical aggregates, elements and sense powers, nor is the person of the nature of the aggregates and so forth, because the aggregates and so forth have the entity of being many and impermanent, like those sorts of faults we'd gone through. So others have imputed the person as permanent and single. So here again, this would be sort of like non-Buddhists that assert that there is a really ultimately truly existent self, and that has this kind of singularity and autonomy or permanence and sort of being a singular entity. And the person as a phenomena cannot exist except as one or many, because there is no other way of existing. So here again, those that would assert that there is so there's a refutation of the kind of self asserted by non-Buddhists, something that is like a permanent, singular, autonomous kind of self, and instead it's we are recognizing here that the person it has the nature of being impermanent and it is a compounded phenomenon. It's not suitable to be something designated as permanent and singular in that way.
Oh yeah, that tingi tam sudwa. Tingi tam shendo chodo mirowe kansa ji ngobo yobar mironde ngobo yobe namba shen mebe chiro se. Tewe na dita de jigden ji al tisa. Oh ta de ranglu ya nema boye teba tu su yordo ranglu liya de namba ke nema boye teba yordo. Oh tezo karisi wersana tanda 다들 풍부대 찍은 선에 견도와서 타대인 선에 견도와서 어딘스르자 그 다들 풍부대 찍도 줘도 매 타대도 줘도 매스거래 다음에다 간도 줘도 매스 디나시 뭐를 찍다 타대 간도 줘도 매스 디나시 다들 딱바인 선에 지금 말에 낭박을 껴다에 용 것도 미딱바인 선에 깨지 지서나 시르바게 깨지 지는 안에 자와 컨트스 제거래서 교단 그도와 뒤에 저거도 왔어. 다 딱바 인스주면도 메다바 인스주면도 다음에다 강도에 저도 매배 다 켈린 게 와라. 스라바 대바랑 나바산제 배 대바카시게 딜바디 디마르소도 괜히 담스르자 풍부다 집도 함소 셴도스는 타대도 미롱에 가사게 뭐뭐 여바 미롱데서 건조고 다음에다 직단 타대 강도에 죄미롱에 가사세 다음에다 강도에 죄미롱에 가사 유세 어떻게 켈린 거래 티롱고 말해서 거라 남베 데센트서 가도와 셴도 죄도 미롱에 가사지 뭐뭐 여바 미롱데서 어때 죄도 매바테 그 말해서 가르에서나 뭐뭐 여바 남바 셴매베서 뭐부터 여나 아니 대 야나 찍도 여베서 야나 타데 레베스 티 거르도 뭐부터 여서나 티 분바당 찍 레베 분바당 타데 레베스 찍당 타데 가로도 여고라 에케란데 분바데 가와다 찍 레베스나 그 말에서라 타데 레서라 티난신레서 뭐부 강가 여신제들 야나 봐주되다 지연고래 야나 가가 연고래서 디니니 가에 많이 계신 거부 용식이 말해서 Kira Tadi Mobu, Tadi Pumbuta Chia Mai, Tade Mai said the Madrid. Tadi Medaba Chutome, Taba Chutome said the Madrid Sugura. Medaba Chutome said the Medaba Lam the Drink Marisha and Taba in Batachus, Koyodi Yora, or Tip Kagdua. Chutu Meru Kansa Jangobo Yoba Meru de Ngobo Yoba Namba Sham Babes. 6 Sinjetela, Sinjetela, Ngobo Yana Chidu Yoguriana, Tade do Yogurese. Chita Tade Kando, maybe Ngobo in Bachi Yungu Marese. Take care of Ngobo de Chita Tade Kando at Chutome, Tameda Kando at Chutome said, take Maris from Gudua. Ngobo Yoba Namba Sham Babes. Tedavena did that day, Jigdangi, Ngadang Eshe Chavandine, Triba Kona Imba. Yinsi chebar chaw, ta tunda su tuishana, jikdena ane nga se rangwa chi samgivare, rangwa chi samgura, ane ngayi longche sido, rangwa taga longche cha, ngayi pungbu, ngayi longche, ngayi chichi chi cha, rangwa taga chi sung, te rangwa taga longche cha chi samgivare, nga da ngayi si, jikda sikdo, nga da ngayi zimbe jikzo la tawa sikdo, o te, ta jikden basu namjo lo lengi kana la samlu chiware, te sambanashi tembare yo marese. You ngubinesu da tubarete yo mardo. Jikdegi ngada ngashi chawasa. Teta vena so tendre yindu tontambaram ta su che su be ta de mebe chena meba teta vena dida de jikdegi ngada ngashi chawa de triba kona ose. Jikden be lo lengi kana liya ngada se ngarawa che ngaishe rawa sambe samlute o te tribare nore mato tingobe ne suta tumbe temba mare sungura nikare ye shechawa de ne triba kona o shechabar cha o se te de bache ta chola ta me bayan de dar kombar cha de ta tanda tamma de kansa ta me she ta dine ma chugi ta me she gdo Shirab di soso tane kombe, ane chugi dame di shegware. Shirab di soso tane, ane semle shenbe chirugi yu mebas. Tandi chidun shed kagdoa, di tanda neju chube omarangi baga lurwa, tanda lobe di Kamalashila te. Tendu neju chube omarangi baga semzambe da tawa da tumbaya, chirugi yu me, semgi tangi sam yin se te kelingi wara, te songu wara. O te chidu me ba de sogudwa. Chidu sene chi su tra te ro rekchala sogwa. Te zo semle lo su chilo li o ma re segre. Semjam ba na shi chane. Pana nga zu milam tangitwa. Milam tangi sa milam na liya yu drama da je chilo chi du sam kabri she she kabri ka che yu drama do lungba de thoya dwa. Te zo thoya de chilo de yu samgi yo de su semge Paksha sebe naware mato semle losu yo marwa, milam negana. Tata, nyeda, chi kawata, me kawata, jina keda, yu mamu tongkutwa. Ti tonti tupe pajo yu samgutwa. Soso semgi nawa yin, paksha sebe nawa yin samgumidwa. O tina shi, mi draw yin, mi draw koran su toya shi wade. Ti mi ngema sa sebe leda, tinte wange, paksha shani chi chargi wade. Semlia chagi wada. Ida ini ida Koran zu semlia pacha wanga chi sani chi chagi wada. Tando ini tando Koran zu chi chaya wada. Menda menda chaya wada. Ti yongya de kare sana paksha sebe na so semge. Nyema ne kombe paksha jora ti nyoba ya sedo ini yunda menda thong yong wada. O semge tangi zamre ma do chilo le yo ma re sigara semjamba. Ti nga zu milam shin se milam pecha wada. Chilo yeba na shi tongdo milam na nga zu. 소소 semmi samro chegma doa. Chilo ne yuji du sampe shena ke, chana ke, kale kak muche kanka nyonga doa milam na. Zako yu chilo le yu sambo ma do, chilo yo ma do, sembi tangi sarwa. Nawa do kora sembi nawa re ma do, sembi rangshi chi re ma do, che ko semle loso, kyang che ne. Marang zini milam tabdi kyang che pacho de yawara che, pe kaka chen tongu doa. O tende yo ma re sungu wara, ti tawa tere. Chö tamze semdi tangi sima yensa. Chiruji sogme, chiruji tame, chiruji rome, rekcha me, yu me se. There's a tone that take a assembly tiny somewhere, so something now. Draw me in a Mikora, they do have a current young in a tendency, assembly. Or dinner, Nyawa Yida, Tandula Soba, Madame Chayo, Tandel Namjung as a person we were. Chu Kanga, which is still Tavina. Nyato Hondo Negalo Chigura, so Tessa, Kanga Neris Chigura. And then we don't do Chanaco China Toya that Chula, tree gaps that so to set that and then now I shall go. Hato Tavina could do it on your long chabina. Long chabina could do this, and Nashi shoots over in the Tomara. Oh, Ida to the Tavina could come to get Chutongu and a Kochura Roching Mare. Chu Ganga Chin Donna called Chu Kia, Gonna Gemma, Sakambush on Rosha. Nyawa Yita, the dollars of 1 meter to Mobuchi in a Tunju Medal, so your reservoir. Take her as a source of leg, a simple thing, Kunshi cigarette, how Kunshi thing a paxas. They are saying the new diamond, so simple tiny some Tongue Guaramado. Chilone Yuchum, Chilone Yuchuna, Kanga Chicken Tongue, the tongue Dawson Guerra. I don't know, Millet Dagava. Chiba Yomardo. The Mabsetus in the Kotu, the Sanako, Mare, which is a Pandoga Korea. Miliatis and the Annuviordo. Or Tinashi, rather mean Mingashi, Yabotongre, Gashiki Tucha Tongre, Gashiki Parma Tongra. You don't want that mount of Parma Toyadua. So leg, Basara says, Yabondo, some Yamari Tuja, some trash. Madame Tongara. Chiruji, you Koran, the chick by the Jimbana, Kanga, the chick by number Teura. Yitumela in a Kanga, Yitumela Tongare. You don't want in the Kanga, you don't want to Tongadua. Kasha, you don't want to Kasha, Yitumela Tongadua. To the social assembly, Paksha Sebe, now assembly Paksha Sebe, now assembly Tanism, Chiru to your Marisonda, or take Geshe Yeshe. Oh, Tijilano.
So here, then, again, looking at this selflessness of the person, so nor is a person, so we may begin first by sort of observing what this self appears to us as if it had this kind of autonomous existence separate from its own side. We then investigate, well, does this person exist as it appears to us? And so there are those like non-Buddhists who have imputed some kind of person or self of the person as a permanent singular kind of an entity. But there are also those who would assert that there's some sort of a self that is inexpressible as either being like one with or separate from the aggregate. So there's actually a particular kind of a Buddhist school that I think it's the Vatsiputriyas, but don't quote me on that, that asserts that there's actually a kind of self that exists neither as one with the aggregates or as many. It's not expressible as either permanent or impermanent. So they would say that like there's kind of something, again, the self isn't a permanent entity as we see the faults that would arise from that, but nor is it impermanent like our aggregates. So they would say, they try to assert that there's something that is either that's inexpressible as either permanent or impermanent. Now here, the problem with that is that these kinds of categories are mutually exclusive. Something is either permanent or it's impermanent. There is no third category. And so too, with the notion of the person existing as a one or many, so the person as a phenomena, as a thing, cannot exist except for as one or as many, because there is no other way of existing. So those types of schools that would try to assert some kind of existence in this third category, whether it's related to the permanence of a self or its sort of nature of existence, there is no kind of third category. It isn't reasonable to assert such a self that's not expressible as either permanent or impermanent, and so forth. So here, it says then the person as a phenomena cannot exist except as one or many, because there is no other way of existing. So any kind of assertion that there's some sort of inexpressible self that exists in this third category is not logical. Therefore, we must conclude that the assertion of the worldly I and mine is wholly mistaken. So when we have this thought of I, that there's this autonomous kind of a self, and then this I, that autonomous sort of independent self enjoys various things that are mine, these are wholly mistaken. Although they appear to our innate mind, the way that they actually exist does not accord with the way that they appear to us. They are just simply mistaken in that way. And so here again, we're going to turn now to the meditation on the selflessness of phenomena. And here then it continues saying meditation on the selflessness of phenomena should also be done in the following manner. Phenomena, in short, are included under 5 aggregates, the 12 sense sources, and the 18 constituents. The physical aspects of the aggregates, sense sources, and constituents are, in the ultimate sense, nothing other than aspects of mind. So here we need to understand that this text of Kamalashila's is written from the perspective of a Yogacara Svatantrika practitioner. And so there's certain particular suppositions that are made like this here of everything being in the aspect or the nature of mind that is particular to that kind of view. So for like Chittamatrans or the mind-only school, those who espouse the Yogacara Svatantrika view assert that there is no external existence. There's no external phenomena apart from the nature of mind. They are all in the nature of mind. Things appear as external objects, but like the way in a dream where we see things that appear to be external, but don't really exist that way. They're all in the nature of mind. We can see a whole sort of like area and various things, and we're sort of interacting, and it feels as though it had that real kind of external existence. It's separate, it's cut off. That's not just our mind. In reality, there's nothing that's not in the nature of mind. And so here, setting aside the sort of particular distinctions between schools, we can see that this is where we get into why it is that things can appear differently to different types of beings. So say, for example, there's the classic example of like either a bowl of water or some kind of water, and the way that it appears differently to different types of beings. So it may be that this appears as water to human beings, and we can go use it for washing and so forth. But to a god, that will appear as ambrosia, as like a heavenly nectar. And to pretas or hungry ghosts, it may appear as water, but then when they try to go near it, it's actually just like dry sand. There's no way that they can get any water. And the assertion of this particular school, that of the Yogacara Svatantrika, they would say that this is due to the various kinds of imprints or ripening in these continuums. And so it is due to the kind of different sorts of imprints or predispositions that have been left on the consciousness, that these different beings see things in different ways. And so this kind of it carries through to everything. Like we can see that, like for say like a peacock, they're able to eat something that would be considered poisonous for a human. Or even when we look at the ways that we as humans see things differently, if it were the case that objects existed from the side of the object, they had that external kind of existence, then it should be the case that whoever sees that object should have the same reaction to it. If there's no sort of connection with our mind, or if it's established from its own side, then the way that that thing appears would have to be the same to everybody if it actually existed in the way that it appears. So here, that's sort of a little overview of what's coming then here. And we're on this line of the physical aspects of the aggregates, sense sources, and constituents are, in the ultimate sense, nothing other than aspects of mind.
Oh yeah, tadi malashana. Chela dame ba yan der kombachades. Choji dame de chiru dame ba computer cheshegdo. Oh cheshi chawane dorzo na pumbunga tiji chonye kamso gela sobare chera. 왜 풍부다 계제다 감다 수 강다에 뭐 되는 수 강이 버텨서 사만에 네 또담바나 셈디 나발에 그 셈레 셴도 요 말에서 셈레 고 타데도 요 말에서라 대다 두터베도 셈레 고 타데도 요 말에서 가르스는 셈레 고 타데베 치로 소지요나 아니 셈레 마데베체 치르기 소요고라 대연에 아니 본바르지나 그 뒤된 초초초다 과제 곱식견 곱식견 버르질 자네 곱식견 매번 뒤된 참미질 토고래 대토에 요 말해서라 셈비 바다바선저 셈리아 뒤된 차다제 예 근데 위에받지마도 매번 차야 요 말해서 어떤 말도 그렇지라 뒤처럼지 바로 차세기 바시나 초초초초초다니 바로절 곱식지에 겨규맹게 뒤전치를 랩고를 뜰레베 요 말해서 뒤인 신자들 가져 충주나 고예연다 지 요거마도 뒤르게 말와 현다투는 바카가도 찍바차가 말도 냠도 스테스코도 타니부터고도 차세지에 매는 고베 템로에 차게도 제가 치료요 말해서 치료요나 뒤참에 요거래서 셈라 마드르체 고 뒤장자 곱시자 초초초초잖아 바로 제 곱시지에 겨규맹게실레 고를 텐데 요 말해서 제가 치료요 말해서 어디봐도 질러면 안 좋으면도 뭐니 손도 매배치로 대다가나 이라 대다 뒤터러지 바도 시글라 뒤터러 남자 차세지 뭐니 소소다나 뭐니 내발 손도 매배치 뒤 참매지 송야 요 말 차세마도 대다가나 통만 매배도네 소라 속바 양다바 많이 발은 거 벌신 배wan게 밀람나 미베 Chula soba nawa shindu chiba namlia semni soso nangi yormato chirugi semlia gyangchen chirudu cheba shindu nangi se gyangcheba kaga semgi nawa tsa maiba chirulia gyangchedu nangi chiru tondo chuba semlia ngo tade yoba nangi yore tende yo mare sungudwa gyangchedu nangi tendamba ne dila sula soba ne semgi nambale kuna medo tendamba 수다 지수를 잘라 속바데 소소 셈기 박차 세베 나와 참제 셈당고 직바데 마도 셈레 세션도 요 말에서 어때봐도 직도나 말로베서 그렇잖아. 뭔데
So then, as it says here, this kind of meditation on the selflessness of phenomena then should be done in the following manner, that phenomena, in short, are included under the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense sources, and the 18 constituents. So these physical aspects of the aggregates, sense sources, and constituents are, in the ultimate sense, nothing other than aspects of mind. Here, again, if it were the case that these things existed as a different sort of nature or essence from mind, we should be able to assert things like forms separate from mind, but we can't actually do that. And so too, when it comes to sort of investigating this, it continues saying, this is because when they are broken into subtle particles and the nature of the paths of these subtle particles is individually examined, no definite identity can be found. So here, when we begin to analyze external phenomena, then it would have to be the case, if they had some sort of real intrinsic existence, that there should be some kind of subtle or indivisible particles that could be found. But if we begin to divide and divide and divide things further, we can't get to a point where there's no longer any sort of divisibility. We can't get to that smallest, most subtle particle, because if you were to assert such a partless particle, or such a particle without any sort of directionality, then it couldn't connect with other particles. They would just sort of like dissolve into one another, because you couldn't have one part connecting with another part. And so in this way, when we investigate and look for some sort of a definite nature or intrinsic like kind of nature to phenomena, including these kinds of external phenomena, there's nothing that can be found. There's no sort of real true existence that can be asserted apart from mind, apart from the apprehending mind.
This one.
No, do so.
Oh yeah, it is.
No. So we'll.
Yeah.
So we will stop there for today as the time has ended.
Thank you, Geshe, for these profound teachings, and also Katrina. So we'll see everyone next week. We'll finish with our dedication.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and our spiritual friends who practice it have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Losong's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayame. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezi, may you stay until samsara ends.
Oh yeah. Oh dear, yeah. Oh, that come. Oh yeah, just delay.
No, tuche na angela.
No.